folks. You may notice there's something a bit different about my language than what has been presented today so far. It's great to meet everyone here. My name's Spencer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a business called Lightsource. I came here from San Francisco, which is a city in California. Is it too loud or too quiet? It's good? Oh, small city, yeah. And so by way of background, I actually spent most of my career at Tesla. I helped lead the Model 3 program, which was Tesla's first mass market electric vehicle, and then was a leader at Waymo, which is Google's self-driving car program. And so today I want to talk about AI and artificial intelligence in a very concrete context. And so we'll start with an introduction to AI, then we'll talk a bit about what is Gen AI versus Agentic AI, some of the applications and future for direct materials, and then we'll share some practical advice as well as a Q&A. The first insight that I want to share with folks here is that AI will not take your job, but somebody who knows how to use it will. That's my thesis. And so let's actually talk about what AI is. So there are different definitions of AI. So I've listed a few here. One's from NASA, Stanford, and then from a compute researcher. And so NASA's idea of AI relates to the idea of complexity. So maybe complexity is the core to what makes something AI versus not. In Stanford, they say it's the simulation of human intelligence, including things like self-correction. So maybe it's that environmental awareness or the human element that makes something AI. In the computing world, some folks say it's about foresight into the environment. So it's about something related to the interaction with the space around. But what actually is AI? And I want to start with like the simplest possible example, which is a scatter plot. So on the bottom, we have someone's height in inches, and on the vertical axis, we have their weight in pounds. So we can see there is some relationship between people's height and weight. It's not perfect. So how do we make sense of this data? And the earliest AI algorithm you might call a trend line or a linear regression. So what can we start to do once we train a linear regression or fit a trend line against a set of stochastic data? We can then start to build in predictive power. So if we have a new person that we have not weighed yet, but we know their height, we might be able to predict what might be their weight. And that's what the predictive power of models of any format would do. Now, I won't go into the full history of LLMs and AI, but suffice to say, this is actually not a recent phenomenon. This is something that has been in development since the 1940s, with some of the earliest classifiers that could separate groups from inputs. The big, I think, changes is that the 1980s, we had machine learning, which was some of the earliest methods that were developed related to things like clustering algorithms, support vector machines, some of the original concepts for neural nets, but we were lacking the computation power to actually see these algorithms develop into reality. In the 2010s, something changed, which is the development of deep learning. We started applying more data, bigger machines, bigger models, and we started to see really interesting results. And in the 2020s, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of generative AI or Gen AI. But a lot of this started with the research team at Google. So our CTO and co-founder, Idan, was actually spent most of his career at Google Research, which is the place where they originally developed a model called a transformer. And a transformer is just a prediction model. The original intention was to build something that would work well for Google Translate. So if you want to translate from I love you to French, je t'aime, you actually want to do the same thing where you're predicting, but instead of a trend line, you're predicting the next word with some kind of weighting system. Now the transformer, I won't get too much into the architecture, but this is ultimately the T in generative pre-trained transformer. So if you hear about GPT, the T is transformer. Generative pre-trained just means that it's generative and it's been trained at scale. And so now there's another term that has emerged really in the last year, which is agentic. Everyone says they're doing agentic AI, and sometimes they're right, but mostly they're not. There's a lot of times where I've talked to software vendors, even at this conference, where I say, okay, they have agentic AI on their banner. Well, what does that mean? Oh, we have an automatic agent to send a notification to the supplier. I'm like, you mean an email? I think that's been around for a while. So I don't really qualify that as agentic AI, but it is good marketing. So let's actually try to set up some construct around this. So what is the difference between generative and agentic? So generative AI, I think of as being something that's reactive. So you input a prompt as the user, and then it outputs, generates a response, a prediction, actually. And that prediction could be anything from text to images to code, if you've used vibe coding or text generation of computer software, or it could be something like music. And so these are just giant pattern matching machines that are learned from huge data sets. They're predicting what should come next, but in a much more sophisticated, large model kind of way. Now, agentic AI, I think the distinction here is that it's actually something that's proactive, meaning that you input a prompt, and instead of getting a generated output, you get a set of actions. And those actions can be self-referential, meaning that you might go from perception to making decisions, to executing, to learning, to then going back to perception again. Why do LLMs come into play? It is a common foundation for both of these approaches. LLMs are literally themselves generative AI, but also LLMs are quite essential to building into agentic workflows the kind of robustness you need to make them less brittle. So if we go forward, just to give some examples, so reactive would be, and there's different skills required for each of these as well. So reactive might be something like we do an input, we review it as a person, we refine, and then we direct. And so I think about generative AI as a lot like being like an army of interns. You let them do some work, but then you have to check in with them at each step and refine their approach. The skills required to be effective using generative AI is the ability to work with tools to accomplish tasks. And moreover, I actually think if you have some concept of programming languages or some software engineering background, you can actually use LLMs in a much more sophisticated way. And then agentic AI, it can be anything from the most basic RPA-like systems, if this then that, to a full chain of thought reasoning system, breaking down tasks into logical steps, having an internal dialogue. And so, for example, you might have an agentic system organize this conference, Procurement Summit, and what it would have to do is start with a multi-agent approach. First is the planner agent. Let's understand the conference requirements. Let's check the available venues. Let's then invite a set of speakers, and then we'll sell tickets. And so the kind of skill that's required to be really effective here is actually more of what I would call systems design thinking. So it's a slightly different paradigm. There's a spectrum between what I would call deterministic and non-deterministic tasks. Non-deterministic tasks, you want to give more freedom. For deterministic tasks, you have things like traditional code execution. Agentic can actually fall into both of these categories. Even pinching and zooming one step deeper, not all agentic systems are built alike. On the left, we have what I would call an agentic workflow. So it's a workflow that is primarily linear, but there is some LLM element. So you can imagine document extraction. You do an LLM analysis, you do data extraction, there's human review, and then you have some set of processing steps. Versus a true AI agent, where you might have a set of agents that define a task, complete those tasks, choose the next task, then reflect, and then make a decision about whether they've achieved the goal state. So let's talk a little bit about applications in practice. For an agentic workflow, you may have seen examples like processing an invoice. This is a good example. You might use LLMs to actually extract the key information because it's nice that machines can now read documents. You do the data extraction, but you want a human to review it, and then ultimately you want that processing to be deterministic. We don't want to let the LLM or the agentic system guess the IBAN or bank account numbers. We want it to be actually determined from the ground truth. On the other side, you might have an agentic AI that does a more complex multi-step task like, hey, I want you to develop me an application for notifying me about expiration dates. So you'd have the agent actually define the tasks, go and complete the tasks, and then decide what are the success criteria that I know that I've completed the task correctly, and then get into that goal or finish state. And so there's actually a whole spectrum between what I would call high control and high agency. On the high control side, you have certain applications and workflows that are much more deterministic with well-defined tasks for which you want maybe some AI powers, but you don't want to let the system do everything on its own because, in fact, it's prone to some amount of errors. On the other side, you have high agency system when the risk of failure is not that high, but the work product or the volume of work product or the speed at which you do things is more important, then you can be leaning towards the high agency situation, but just be prepared for potentially incorrect outcomes. There's a lot of flavors of agentic approaches today, everything from simple reflex agents to model-based agents, goal-based agents, utility-based agents, all the way to full learning agents. This is one specific agentic framework just to give an example of something that you might or some software developer might build today. And again, there's a lot of recipes now. Everyone's kind of figuring this out. So quick caveat, what I'm saying today, in 1 year will be extremely outdated. So this is just the state of the world today coming out of Silicon Valley, which I'm very biased, but I think it is the bastion of a lot of this technology. The user does an input, there's a planning agent, there's some amount of sequential flows, some amount of parallel flows. Sequential is if this, then that. We have to process step one to go to step two. Parallel workflows are things that can be done side by side, so I don't need to wait for Gunnar to respond in order to decide if I'm inviting Jim. We're going to invite both of them at one go. And then you might have other kinds of memory systems, whether it's user profiles, RAG, you might want observability, analytics, and then ultimately, the last step might be some kind of guardrails to make sure that you're not hallucinating and things aren't going awry. But there's been a bit of a challenge that we've seen in the industry, and this is something that I call the AI capability overhang. The progress that we've seen in the foundation models and the wrappers around them, things like ChatGPT and Anthropic, have progressed really quickly. And something that I've been a little bit keeping track of is the fact that AI products that portend to make usage of these tools have not quite caught up. A lot of times I find, what I can do in ChatGPT is more advanced than what my businesses' systems are supposed to be able to do. And so I call this the capability overhang, and we're working very hard at our company to try to really bridge this gap. But ultimately, you have to be technologists to do it, not just practitioners. I've seen a lot of AI washing. I think of this a little bit like greenwashing, but for the world of AI. So you have a ton of these legacy platforms that were built 10, 20, 30 years ago before the advent of this technology. And then someone says, hey, we have to really get into AI. And so what do? They take a traditional app and then they'll add a few bells and whistles. Maybe they just plop a chatbot on top. So I think of that as a person wearing a muscle suit. But down here we have Arnold, who's, I guess, Austrian, not German. And I think of this as actually what a native AI system is, just like Lightsource, where we built the system from the ground up in a world where LLMs and other kinds of AI systems were already a reality. And so we can think about using AI infrastructure and domain-specific models for each element of our application. So now that we've set a little bit of a baseline for what is AI, what is agentic AI, I'm going to walk through a little bit of the future of direct materials. Our mission is very simple. It's to elevate direct and strategic indirect procurement teams with world-class software tools. This is a little bit of where we play as a business. So we focus on direct materials and strategic indirect. This feels to me like a huge gap in the market. For a long time, we've had sourcing procurement tools, but they're really focused on the requisitioner experience or tail spend management. How have we ignored the 80% of spend that's really staring us in the face, which is our direct materials and strategic indirect? To achieve this goal, we've built up a world-class team, so a mixture of folks from Tesla, Waymo. Peter led McKinsey's procurement practice for a decade as a partner there. Before that at Carney. Idan, our CTO, and Chris, they were at Google Research, the birthplace of the transformer model, the granule at the heart of GPT. We're backed by great investors. You may have seen in the news that we just raised a milestone financing led by Bain Capital and Lightspeed at $130 million valuation, so pretty substantial growth. And we have a range of excellent customers from the automotive space to aerospace and defense to consumer electronics to retail and apparel. The unifying theme is that they're all Fortune 500 and Global 2000. Procurement with the right tools is an extremely impactful business unit. It's one of the few places where you can actually say we are concretely getting a reduction of spend and improving our margin. But other stuff matters too, like faster sourcing cycles and happier teams, both on the buying side and supply side. These are the wrong tools, so I'd call this my anxiety slide. So this is screenshots of a lot of our, I see some laughter, so does this look like your laptop today? Yeah? One screen? Okay, I have two. So this is anything that's more trouble than it's worth. You know, a lot of tools to date have been built in a way to limit us from doing the wrong things, but not enable us to do the right things faster and easier. And that's why today, 25 years after the introduction of the earliest e-sourcing software, 76% of procurement teams are still using Excel and email as their primary tool. And anyone who's here is thinking a little bit more about the future, and so we're already taking the right next steps. But the reality is when we look at sales tech conferences, there's not 20, 30 vendors, there's 3,000 vendors. And the adoption of tools is not, you know, we're really using Excel and email, we hope we can get there one day. It's ubiquitous, things like Salesforce and CRMs and Customer 360s. So the folks that we interact with every day, they're coming to the table with better technology and better knowledge. So my life's dream is to bridge this gap and make the chart on the left look a little bit more like the chart on the right. And that's why we built Lightsource. It's a next generation operating system for procurement teams. In general, I think there's a set of foundational activities that are core across any procurement organization. It's what do we buy, who do we buy it from, how much do we buy it for, tracking that it happened, and then payment. This is a little bit of a theory of mine, but you take those foundational activities, you multiply it by the spend landscape, which is unique depending on your type of business, and you get a set of processes that are required to be completed. And those can be either done by people, technology, or some mix of both. And so when you're talking about direct, the what to buy is very different from indirect. So it's not necessarily a requisition intake with process orchestration. We're talking about EDI and demand planning, something strategic happening from the business. Who to buy from, maybe we have punch-outs or contracted pricing and MSAs, or maybe we need to go and actually run RFX with suppliers directly. How do we pay for it? In the direct materials world, it's the ERP. In the indirect world, often it's the P2P. I know that there's this is oversimplification. Every company is unique in its own special way. And then tail, of course, it's like the maverick needs. Preference of the individual is how people choose what they buy. And then ultimately, it's expediency is what you're solving for. How can we just get this done faster? And so my view is that there is a different model, a future model for direct materials that is actually different than the traditional, you know, requisition to intake to procure process orchestration thing that seems to be happening right now in the market, and it really begins with PLMs. And so the problem that we tried to start solving was, hey, how can we take the engineering team? Right now what they do is they will email procurement and say, hey, can you send this out to suppliers and negotiate and quote for us? Procurement will email specs in the form of zip files to their supply base. Then the suppliers will have questions. We'll send it back to engineering. They will update the spec. We send it back out to suppliers. Finance gets involved, manufacturing gets involved, stakeholders get involved. Long story short, it is 500 to 2,000 emails just to figure out who's the right supplier at what price, and is that price fair? We say, let's bring this into a single pane of glass, which is Lightsource, pull in the requirements and specs directly from the PLM, do all the supplier interaction in one place, and then when we're done, push out the pricing to the ERP for purchase order creation. This is a quick overview, just end-to-end of what we do and what we don't do. We do everything from bill of materials and spend management to supplier discovery, benchmarking and cost engineering, e-sourcing, which is our bread and butter, as well as AI-enabled contract lifecycle management and the often forgotten supplier relationship management. What we don't do is anything on the ERP or P2P side. So if you have an ERP system, if you're going through a decade-long S4 transformation, continue with it. We're built to dovetail with those systems. The final thing I'll share about our business is that we are actively used in over 100 countries across 4 continents. We are also the only procurement tool and I'll add a big caveat, the only procurement tool that is natively available in mainland China. So if you have any suppliers based out of China, you may notice that they have trouble accessing Western sites. That's because they have a firewall. So we have Lightsource.cn, which is our China local version of our site. We have an internet cloud provider license from the government of Beijing. So if you want to get like 70% of your suppliers using a tool, you have a lot of options. If you want to get 100% of your suppliers using a tool and getting into a single pane of glass, then Lightsource is frankly the only option. I'll wrap up with one sort of anecdote and just a philosophy of mine that I'd like to share, which is that I never want to be technology looking for a problem. That's how you end up with shelfware, things that are bought and not used. We always want to start by thinking first about refining down to 1 or 2 or 3 problems that are really important, that if we solve them, it will truly move the needle. And then work backwards to which are the right solutions that'll help us actually achieve that. Does anybody know who this guy is on the left over here? This might be a bit of an American reference. I'm not talking about Bill Clinton, by the way. I think we know who he is. But the guy next to him is a guy named Dean Kamen, and he was the inventor of a product called the Segway, which is like a 2-wheeled self-balancing scooter. Originally, the technology was developed for a more agile wheelchair, and then he thought, okay, maybe we can use this technology and build a mobility device. And it was heralded in the United States as being the greatest invention. Steve Jobs and major investors like John Doerr were saying this is going to replace walking. But the problem is, today, we're still walking. And these Segway scooters never really, at $8,000, nobody really wanted to buy one. It was a technology, a very cool, interesting technology, solving a non-existent problem. And to finally sort of wrap this up a little bit, this is a bit of a chart that I've borrowed from a McKinsey report. But when we think about tying it back to AI, where agentic AI and LLMs, things that are less deterministic, higher agency, can be best applied, I think about the areas that are today the most difficult to automate. So as we go downstream toward things like payment processing, we actually want something that is deterministic. I don't need AI for processing payments. I want it to be interpretable and observable and direct. If I input this bank account number and I initiate a payment, the payment gets made, there's no objectivity or subjectivity. But upstream of that, in the source to contract arena, you have a lot less risk of failure and more controls downstream and systems that are more difficult to automate. And so if you're looking for a place where you can really use AI to revolutionize your business, your process, and achieve great outcomes, I would advocate that you look at Lightsource or a solution like it. So I'll pause here, and I'm happy to answer any Q&A about anything you could be curious about from Gen AI. There's no question that's too silly. I know this is a hot topic that there's a lot of buzz, but not a lot of truth. Anything from that to, is the fentanyl crisis in San Francisco as bad as everyone says? So I'm happy to talk about anything. So I'll open up to questions. I think we have about 10 more minutes. So, and I think there's actually a mic going around. So just raise your hand. I'm happy to talk about anything that could be of interest to you guys. But thank you for joining the talk.
Are there any questions? Yes. We will find one person. It's not a compass. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, short question from my side. You mentioned in the beginning you see that it will be more work to do in purchasing or procurement than today with all the technology. How do you see the procurement in 5 years? If you look what you have shown us here, what will be our job look like in the future if we really do what you are sharing here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the first thing I'll share is that anyone who says that they know is probably not being directly honest. So what I can share is my perspectives and what I've been seeing. I think there's a few trends that we should be aware of. The first thing is that busy work, boring work, tactical work is going to be more and more automated. And so over time, what we're going to see is a transition away, in my opinion, from low-skilled labor just taking actions mechanically to those being automated by systems. And then what's left behind is people developing strategies and managing those systems. So I like to think about the example of assuming that AI isn't perfect and it doesn't become perfect in the next 5 years. I would think about it like someone having a team of AI interns. What would you do if you had 1,000 interns? Okay, they will go and do all of the busy work, but I still need to direct them. And so I think people who are focused on strategy and systems level thinking will ultimately prevail. There was a great tweet by Andre Karpathy, who's a former colleague of mine. He was the head of autopilot at Tesla when I was working on the Model 3 program. And he had a tweet 2 years ago that really stuck with me. He said that English is the new hot programming language. And this is something that I've thought about a lot. So over time, I know you're puzzled because what the heck am I even talking about? So it used to be when you're programming computers that it was ones and zeros, right? You were getting into punch cards. Then eventually it was like, okay, we're going to abstract from that one level up. We're going to have hexadecimal, or we're going to have machine code or assembly language. Then it's like, oh, great, we can now code in C or C++. And then Python is developed as a much more user-friendly language that's mostly just writing in English, and it compiles down to C. And now through LLMs, we actually have the ability to write programs, but it's done by speaking to the machine in English. And so I think that people that are understanding how to use AI will ultimately be 1,000 times more effective. Like historically, I think it's been that if you're more tech agile, you're marginally better than your colleagues. But I think in a world where you have access to extend your capability through the use of automation and tools, both ones that you use at the corporate level and then also personal productivity, frankly, I think those kinds of people, that's why I said at the beginning, AI won't take your job, but people who know how to use it will. So I would recommend that anybody here, do two things. One is advocate for bona fide AI solutions that solve problems within your business, and in parallel, nights and weekends, play with these things. See what's the latest stuff. Go on, I would never say this at a professional business conference, but go on Reddit and go to some of the LLM channels and read what are the posts that are getting a lot of attention and interest. Go to Y Combinator, Hacker News. I think it's very exciting. It's a very exciting time in general, but I think it's important for people in any field, including procurement, to stay really literate because the world is shifting quicker than I think we've seen it. I think this is a bigger shift, by the way, than mobile, like the iPhone. That was just a miniaturization of the computer and the internet. So I think this is the biggest shift since the advent of computing. It would be my 2 cents on it. Yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, and you must be open for it, in your workflow. So.
Of course, yeah.
Stefan Weinlinde from Climeworks. Climeworks is a startup scale-up, however you want to call us.
Yep.
A lot of Tesla guys there, by the way.
Cool.
So we are in the situation that we are building up a lot of things from scratch. So we are in a situation where we have to make a decision. Do we want to build it the traditional way with people, or do we want to go for AI from the very beginning onwards? A lot of the tools and things that we see on this conference go from the assumption, well, there is already a status quo, like traditional implementation of certain e-procurement tools, et cetera, et cetera. My question to you is, what would be your advice to companies like us? Should we continue and go for an implementation status which is going, well, to a certain level, or should we just go and target AI from the beginning on? Thanks.
It's a really great question, and I want to pull it apart into 2 different branches. One is how should you be using AI in your own development, and the other is how should you be using AI in your product. And I think actually both of them are important. My general view is that if a product today is not built in an AI native way, it's already outdated. So that's my initial perspective. And I think that tools that people are implementing today, I'm very sad to say, it's going to be comical how ancient they will feel to us in just 3 years when we're required to continue just like clicking buttons and typing in text when other systems are doing much more for us automatically. We may even find that there's totally new user interfaces that weren't popular before for business software. A crazy example could be voice, right? If I have a machine that's automating more of my process, can I just talk to it and it tells me what it's doing? and then it presents me a report afterwards? Do I even have to go to my computer and click through, or can I just instruct it to go and run a RAG function, a retrieval augmented generation, on our data sets and then take action from there? The second, so absolutely, I'm very pro AI, by the way, as you can probably tell. So definitely use it in your product for your customers. And then the second is, how do you look internally at yourself and decide, how do we use this for our own development? I would say here, again, like, I would really try to invest in using AI. We're also a growth stage company. We are on the journey to unicorn status, but not there yet. And what I always tell the team is that this is the most exciting time in history for small organizations with a talent-dense employee pool to build great things. If I think about the large companies out there, what are their main advantages? Their main advantage is, one, they have money, they have resources, they have people, and they already have built a lot of product. Now, what if in the future, and maybe actually even in the present, 10 people can now do the work of 10,000 people because they're commanding an extension of themselves in the form of AI or agents? They can duplicate and build to the same level that it would have taken those other companies decades to build to. They can do it without needing as many people. And those big companies are never going to chase the small companies down the rabbit hole because nobody wants to take their main advantage and obliterate it, right? And so I think this is the most exciting time ever for actually small companies to be able to grow very quickly and make an impact on the large legacy providers. That's my 2 cents. But I think that to do that well, you have to both include AI in your product and also think about how you can use it in your own development work. Now, within that, there's a lot of granularity. You could say, hey, I'm going to use a system like Cursor or Windsurf, which are context-aware, like repo-aware code agents. So these are like development environments that use LLMs to help you. They co-author code with you, basically. And so you can use that to just code faster, or you could use a totally wholesale system like a Replit or a Lovable, where you just tell it what you want it to build and will totally build it for you. I think ultimately, though, like, those are more prototyping tools, and I still think having really high quality engineering teams who are thinking about the system in an enterprise grade way, but just using AI to enhance their capabilities and to do more faster and to use them for the right use cases. Great use case, testing. Why write tests? It's not a big risk to have tests built by AI. It can write more of them, and if a test is like not great, it's not going to break our system because it's not actually in production. So I hope that adds a little bit of color to how I think about at least using AI, but I'm a big advocate.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something more now? Because you was...
Well, I guess what I want to say is I think people find this kind of stuff sort of exciting and scary at the same time. And I understand that. Like, I feel that way too. Like, the world is changing kind of quickly. But I think there's going to be a lot more good that comes out of it than bad. And historically, if we look back in previous decades, any time that a new technology was developed by people, there's always some amount of caution when approaching it. And then we find that it makes our lives so much better that the costs far outstrip the costs are far dwarfed by the benefits. And so I would just take this with like a real grain of optimism. And the exciting thing, I think, for people in procurement, where we are not software engineers, is now all of a sudden we, as people who don't know how to develop code, have the ability to automate our own work without needing to rely on technologists, without having to rely on software engineers. So I think for us, this will actually be a big democratization of access to technology. But again, it's going to really favor those who are innovative in their thinking and their approach. Are there any other questions that I can help answer? Otherwise, I'm also happy to stick around and talk with anyone. I love this topic, and I am very, talk about this all the time in the United States. This is the first time we've done a conference in Germany, so.
It's so nice to have you here. Such a long journey. Thanks for that.
Thanks
for your nice insights. And maybe we will have a talk and a chat with a good cocktail, maybe.
Okay.
On an after-show party,
Sounds good.
Yeah, you must be here. So thank you for Spencer.
Thank you.